share my create task that I coded for my AP Computer Science performance task. So my project consisted of a Morse code type game, and it was about almost 300 lines of code. You run the code real quick. When you run the code, you get popped up with this window, right? And it uses Tinkercad or Tinker, my bad. Okay, so you have this is your main page. You get confronted with how to play, right? And it tells you the instructions of this game, right? And you can go back home and you can start. But it alerts you that audio is needed. Here's the title of the game: Code X Morse, right? So it plays a sequence of audios, and you can go to this reference page, and it tells you how to use the reference sheet. And here is what you use for your Morse code sequence and the corresponding letter. And then you can go back to the game, and it will replay the audio, right? And then you can replay the audio by clicking play sound. And then in the top left corner, you have your score, and then it increments by one every time you get the answer right. So if I was to type in a number and I submit, this says please only submit a letter. Now let's say if I try to get my way around it and try to submit a sequence of letters, it tells me to only submit one character. Okay, and then if I get it wrong, it tells me incorrect. All right, now let's try to get it right. Okay, so we go to the reference page. We see here slash. Okay, I'm guessing it's X, right? Let's hear it again. X. And then you can also submit by just pressing enter. And there you go, correct. And score increments by one. And then every time you score a point, you get a new sequence or a new character. That was two beeps, and we see that is I. You can submit it capitalized or lowercase, it doesn't matter. It takes it in either way. This whole code got me a 4 on the AP exam, but keep in mind, it's not just the performance task that gets you your score on the exam. It's mostly the MCQ. So even if you don't submit your performance task, you can still get a qualifying score on your AP exam. However, it still is essential to submit and do well on your performance task, as it will only help you and will not bring you down at all. And in my opinion, this is probably the most essential part of the whole class because you get to put everything you've learned in the class into a nice project you can do. Now, you can work with a partner on this project, and I definitely do recommend that. However, I recommend to not code the same project. I would recommend to have a buddy or a partner, if you will, and just ask them for advice. Send them your code from now and then. Allow them to run, test your code, and take their feedback and improve based on what they say. Or add certain suggestions or recommendations that they believe will make your code better. Whether that's a syntax error, a logical error, or just to make something aesthetically more pleasing, right? I also want to clarify that the reason I would say work with a partner but not code the same project is because coding your own individual project will allow you to understand your code truly and fully, right? Because if you work with a partner, you may be more lenient to slack off or leave them to work on it and you work on certain portions, right? But having your code just be your own work and all your work is so much better because if you look at your code on the day of the exam, you'll know what it is, you know what it does, you've coded, you'll probably even know the line that it's on your code, right? Well, if you work with a partner, they can make some changes you may not agree or some changes that you would have done another way. Now, onto my other piece of advice for your performance task is to understand the requirements for this portion, right? When I first made this code, I sort of knew what I was required to do. It wasn't until the due date was coming up closely that I was realizing that I was missing certain things. So I quickly went back to my code and added and changed what I needed to change so it can fit the requirements, which I could have avoided this and saved so much more time if I originally fully comprehended what I was required to do. Second piece of advice: choose the right tools. Right. So if your class spends the whole time learning Python and then all of a sudden you choose to do block code or JavaScript because it's easier, I I highly discourage that because that just demonizes everything you've learned into just quite literally nothing. I believe that if you spent the time in class learning a certain language and then all of a sudden you submit a project that is a completely different language, I think that just takes away from your whole experience from the class, right? You go to the class and to learn coding, you learn to code, right? I've had classmates of mine that learned Python because that's what was taught in the class, but then switched to code.org or Scratch because it's easier. And I'm not hating on these applications. I just think that if you're going to learn something in class, you should apply it to the actual exam. Right, I think that that's the beauty of knowledge and the beauty of classes and teachers that you have, and you should apply it. Personally, I think specializing in the programming language that your teacher teaches you within the class is much better because ask all the students in that class for help or your buddy, right? Because they also know the language. Because if I'm coding, let's say I've had previous experience in HTML, and then I ask my partner, "What do you think of my code?" or "How can I fix this syntax error?" They likely won't be able to help me, so I'll have to look to sources on YouTube or ChatGPT, which can work. However, I think it's just better off to have a partner. Well, on this performance test, you cannot ask your teacher for advice. So I would just stick to the language everyone in your class knows, or the language that your partner mostly knows, and the language that obviously you know the most, which ideally should be the one that was taught in class. On to my other piece of advice: document. What I mean by document is add comments. So as you can see here, I have comments. So scoreboard, list for character and their correlated Morse code, imports, and so on, right? So why is adding documentations important to your code? Well, if you're working with a partner, this is absolutely essential because you can give your code to your partner and they can easily identify what's going on in your code. So if I just gave my partner this, they would just see a map basically. And they don't really know what's happening unless I show this, and what's happening, right? But adding comments that they can understand is so much more easier and can summarize what you've coded basically. My other piece of advice: I recommend that you incorporate relevant algorithms and data structures into your projects. Doing so will just make your code much more effective and concise. And you don't want such a massive line of code that basically does it works, but it's a long way, right? Having something that gets to the point in the shortest amount of time is so much more time saving and effective because it allows people or your partner to understand much more clearly what's happening. And then this could further be more cleared and specifies with even documentations. Hence why I think documenting within your code is always important, especially when programming something at this scale of importance where it allows you to submit and gain college credit. To test your code thoroughly. So, after you, for example, if you add an audio file, make sure you don't just go, well, this looks right. test the code and make sure you hear the audio when it's meant to play, right? When for example, if I added this this audio file and or for example, if I added this audio file, I want to make sure that it works. And I don't just want to go based off how it looks. So I would test the code, make sure that when it is called, it does work and I can hear it. I do want to mention that I don't think my code is perfect. I know there's areas that it can improve on and areas that are inefficient and ineffective and areas that are effective. Uh, for example, like with the audio, how here, let me show you real quick, right? So, for example, uh, one part that I really wanted to fix was here. If I click reference sheet and I go back here, I don't want this to play again at all. I just wanted it to go back and forth. So I know there's a way to fix it, but deadline was coming up and I didn't have much time, nor was I really wanting to change it because I saw it wasn't that big of a deal. Which this brings me on to my other piece of advice: time. Make sure you keep track of deadlines and you make sure you keep track of your time thoroughly. So, the performance task asks you to submit a variety of things from your documentation and your actual code and your video. Make sure you keep track of when those assignments are due. And the reason I say that was because how I demonstrated in my code, uh, I knew that deadline was approaching, but I didn't realize how close it was. Right. So if I did have more time, I would have liked to remove this feature where if I go to my reference sheet and I go back to the game, it plays the audio automatically regardless, which I didn't like, but time was not in my favor, so I didn't get to, really have time to change it, or in other words, fix it, if you will, right? So one thing I do regret is not keeping track of time effectively, as doing so would have allowed me to make my code much more better and plan ahead of time. And my last piece of advice is just enjoy the process. I I think it's so much more satisfying when you can code something and do something you enjoy, and then you have your finished product and look back at everything you've done and realize that it was a lot of work, but you got your final product. And I think coding is such a great thing to learn, especially during a time when technologies are all around. I think most people tend to just want to get the project done and over with, which I understand. It's almost the end of the year. You're about to take your AP exam and you just want to get it over with. But I think the conception of school has definitely shifted where it's more based around grades and less based on knowledge. So I would have liked to view this more as like an learning path, right? Like I get to do this and it was amazing that I got to learn Python. I don't think my knowledge of Python is obviously the best, but I think I grasped a great amount of knowledge from just my introductory course into Python and computer science. All CSP students should definitely apply that into their lives where they just appreciate the knowledge that they gain, whether it was bad or good, right? It's just you always get to learn.